Originally released in 2011 during Zelda's 25th anniversary, Skyward Sword was a defining game in the series. The first in the series to not just utilize full motion controls, but to have a game built around them. It's an origin story to help tie all the legends together, and a starting point for the then newly established canon timeline. The game has long been a fan favorite, but has met strong criticism since its original release. Lackluster open world in the sky, motion controls that at times were completely non-responsive, limited areas to explore, and pacing issues caused Skyward Sword's reputation to take a huge hit. Skyward Sword was the last of the 3D Zeldas to receive a remake. While Wind Waker and Twilight Princess got the HD treatment, it was up in the air for a long time whether or not Skyward Sword would get a revision. Series producer Eiji Aonuma stated that to make the game without motion controls would be impossible. Now, 10 years later, Skyward Sword HD has soared onto the Nintendo Switch with many revisions and optional motion controls. But does the HD version fix the glaring issues of the original and make this the definitive way to play Skyward Sword? Let's find out. Now, before we get started with this review, it's going to have spoilers. I love that Breath of the Wild has brought in so many new people and introduced Skyward Sword to them, but if you came here not expecting spoilers, I don't know what to tell you, Chief. Skyward Sword is 10 years old, and I'm writing this a month after it re-released. So, here's your spoiler warning. Skyward Sword tells the origin story of the Zelda series. It establishes the creation of the Master Sword, the goddess Hylia, and Demise's curse. The story of this game is so monumentally important to Zelda lore. It tells the tale of how goddess Hylia sealed away Demise and reincarnated into a girl of Skyloft, Zelda. She and the hero chosen by the goddess, Link, would have to undergo many trials to prove they were capable of obtaining the Triforce and vanquishing Demise once and for all. Skyward Sword's story starts with Link and Zelda as students of the Knight Academy. After performing in the wing ceremony, the two are enjoying each other's company in the skies when a tornado sends Zelda plummeting into the clouds below. When Link awakens back on Skyloft, he learns of his destiny as the hero chosen by the goddess from Fi. Fi is the spirit of the sword and guides Link on his journey through many temples in search of Zelda, harrowing trials set by the goddess in the Silent Realm, and their quest to temper the goddess sword into the Master Sword by finding the flames of the old gods. Along the way, they must fight the demon lord Girahim, whose sole purpose is to revive his master, Demise. Above all else, Skyward Sword excels in its story. The strong character relationships are a huge driving force. The romantic implications between Link and Zelda have never been more apparent than in this game. It's not only believable, but it's the backbone of Skyward Sword. Zelda has such a cute and charming personality in this game right from the beginning, and you instantly fall in love with her and Link's dynamic. Sure, it's a bit of slice of life anime, but establishing a strong motivator like love early on gives such urgency to save her once things start to go wrong. Zelda has a strong, definitive personality that gives her character so much life, and it's one of the few times in the series where she has substantial character development. One of the best cutscenes in Skyward Sword helps show this. When Link reunites with Zelda, and she lets him know that she is going to seal herself for thousands of years to prevent Demise's return, she has this extremely emotional goodbye with Link. She tells him that even though she has accepted her responsibility as the goddess, that she is still Link's Zelda, and asks him to wake her up for once. Moments like that are what set Skyward Sword apart from every other Zelda game in the series. Of course, there are touching and emotional moments, but in this game, the attention to character development and relationships gives us more impact than we see in a lot of the other games in the series. Now, I could continue to simp over Zelda, but it would be criminal of me to not mention the other amazing characters in this game. Obviously, Groose. Groose has such a wonderful character arc, and I think he is one of the most realistic characters in this game. Groose starts out as this pompous bully who wants nothing more than to smack Link around and steal Zelda away from him. But as the story progresses, Groose begins to realize that he can't do much of anything to save Zelda after she's gone to the surface. When he follows Link to the surface, he learns this the hard way and becomes depressed at the thought that he can't do anything. Thanks to Impa though, Groose becomes more proactive and makes the Groosinator, without which Link would never be able to seal the imprisoned away. And not to mention, Groose saves Zelda's body after her soul has been taken by Demise. Groose plays such a huge part in saving Zelda, and the fact that he doesn't have some kind of national Hylian holiday is tragic. Zelda villains are predominantly evil pigmen, so anytime we get something different, it's a real treat. Girahim is Skyward Sword's main villain, and in my opinion, one of the best in the franchise. Again, going back to strong personalities, Girahim is overly eccentric and theatrical. He plays with Link, brushing him off like some small pest rather than the would-be hero. His motives are clear. He wants nothing more than to revive his master, and once you learn that Girahim is Demise's equivalent of Fi, it makes it all make so much more sense why he's hellbent on reviving him. There are so many unique characters in Skyward Sword. From the Magmas and Dragons, the citizens of Skyloft, the Lanayru mining robots, this game is chock full of interesting people. They all help breathe life into a world that at times can feel very small. When you think of Skyward Sword, motion controls are probably what come to mind. For a long time, I swore by motion controls. After playing Twilight Princess on the Wii and Wii Sports Resort's extremely fun sword fighting game mode, I thought that they were the future of the franchise. I didn't want any new Zelda game to be made without them. I kept that opinion up until I finished Skyward Sword on Hero Mode. The Wiimote's finickiness and constant recalibration left me strongly wanting to be able to lay back in a reclined position to play Skyward Sword. My arm was constantly tired from my flailing, and I remember getting very frustrated when my hits wouldn't land, even though I was swinging from the correct angle. With Skyward Sword HD, I made sure to try out both motion controls and the newly implemented button controls. Unfortunately for me, I still had issues with the motion controls. Flying with the motion controls was so incredibly uncomfortable that I had to swap immediately. I could not do it. The motion controls do seem to be more responsive than on the Wii, but I still found inconsistencies. For example, the eye-rolling puzzle in Skyview Temple where you rotate your sword around to spin the eyes took me a few minutes to complete with many recalibrations and position changes on motion controls, but the second I swapped to button controls, it instantly worked. I wanted to go through the first dungeon with motion controls, and I did just that. But as soon as I finished it, my playthrough was done entirely with button controls. The layout for button controls at first seems kind of weird and unnatural. I constantly was yanking my sword out when I was trying to use the new free camera, but over time the controls became second nature. It's kind of surprising how intuitive it is using the right stick for sword swings. I found it more accurate, easy, and less time consuming to use the button controls. The added benefit that my old decrepit joints aren't buckling under me swinging Joy-Cons around is a huge plus as well. Being able to finally sit back and lounge around playing Skyward Sword gave me a whole new perspective on the game. However, there were many times where the button controls would act up too. Sometimes Link would be slow on the draw when I tried to pull the sword out, and an enemy would get a hit on me. Or the most common issue I had, which was with the final blow. I'm not sure if it was just the growing pains of figuring out a new control scheme, but I struggled getting the final blow to land many times early on in my playthrough. Later on though, I noticed it wasn't as much of an issue, so that could entirely be on me. I know for many people, the only way to experience Skyward Sword is to play with motion controls, but for me, the button controls just make this game so much more enjoyable and comfortable to play. I love that we have the option more than anything. I imagine there are some Zelda fans out there that have mobility issues that never got a chance to play Skyward Sword because of the motion controls. Button controls make this game more accessible for so many people. The combat of this game is focused on sword combat first and foremost. Enemies are designed with specific movement patterns to help telegraph how you are supposed to swing. The enemy design for this game is absolutely incredible, with battle scenarios that are super engaging and fun, like with the Stalfos and Staldras. Then, at times, it can be incredibly frustrating. Those electric bokoblins come to mind. Seems like every time I swing in the right direction, they change at the absolute last second and I end up getting shocked. While it's very obvious, it still makes for really engaging combat and punishes those of us who are a bit more impatient. Skyward Sword excels at making you feel like you are in combat, parrying and waiting for the right window to strike are fundamental in playing this game. That can be a hard lesson to learn for those like me who tend to just try the brute force method. You'll learn the hard way that patience is the ideal strategy in this game. Even though Skyward Sword is focused on sword combat, there of course are other avenues of combat. The old familiar items still have their uses and translate incredibly well onto the button-controlled layout. The bow and arrow, beetle, bombs, whip, hell, all the items work just as seamlessly as the sword. It gave me a newfound appreciation for the items in this game, not having to recalibrate or worrying about my inconsistent arm swings making everything go haywire. To no one's surprise, the dungeons still hold up. Skyward Sword has some of the best dungeon design in the series, with notable examples being the fan favorite Ancient Cistern and the Sand Ship, with its use of time shift stones making very interesting puzzles. These dungeons are challenging. I found myself many times getting lost or stumped by a puzzle, but the gratification of figuring out after a long time of running in circles is still a fundamental part of why I enjoy Zelda games. The dungeons lean heavily into their themes and aesthetics, and it makes them so memorable. Even though you have to track back through the same overworld areas, the dungeons are designed so differently from one another that they don't overly feel similar to any of the previous dungeons. Sadly, a big point of contingency for me are the bosses. I am not in love with a lot of the boss designs in Skyward Sword. Tantalus is atrocious. This thing looks like some de facto Muppet rejection. For a dungeon that is so interesting and unique, this bland squid misses the mark so hard. Scaldera is kind of the same way. I mean, are we not going to pretend that this isn't Mike Wazowski? Most of the bosses are just forgettable for me. The shining light in an otherwise bleak world of bosses is Coloctus. This boss fight is fun, challenging, and unique. Additionally, the final boss fight against Demise. The setting, the build-up, the constant beatdowns this guy gives you, it's awesome. The fight is challenging and hard, and you constantly have to parry correctly. The ending blow with a lightning charged Master Sword, like come on man, that's like the most badass death a Zelda villain has ever had. I love that boss fight, it's easily the best in the game. Skyward Sword has one of those soundtracks that has a handful of bangers that stick with you. Ballad of the Goddess, Farum Woods, Skyloft, Isle of Song, Grusa's theme, Romance in the Air, they're all notable themes and my favorites from this game. This time around, I actively paid more attention to the music than when I first played Skyward Sword all those years ago. The dungeon themes, the quiet tranquility of themes like Gate of Time, the Dragon's theme, the battle themes, all of them are amazing. The orchestrated soundtrack to this game gave new life to Zelda music and changed it forever. The soundtrack has sweeping orchestral pieces like the powerful staff credits theme. The music in this game lends itself so perfectly to the setting and the themes presented. It may not be as iconic as OSTs like Ocarina of Time, of course, but Skyward Sword's music plays its part perfectly and provides that dreamy feeling that I don't think you get in any of the other Zelda games. When the Zelda team makes remakes, they usually do it with a few purposes in mind. Sometimes it's accessibility issues, others need to be reworked and adjusted to make them a more enjoyable experience. Skyward Sword had a ton of issues, and with the huge success of Breath of the Wild, Aonuma saw an opportunity to introduce all the new Zelda fans to a traditional Zelda that heavily impacts Breath of the Wild. The biggest hindrance for Skyward Sword to this new audience would be the motion controls, so they set out to remake the game with a button-controlled layout. Skyward Sword also received a much-needed facelift, and I think it shows for itself that the higher resolution makes this game so much more beautiful than it could have ever dreamed. The weird haziness that plagued it on the Wii is non-existent here, and the result is gorgeous. The clarity of HD makes the water-style art direction more impressive and gives Skyward Sword a look that will age extremely well. Small additions like item pop-ups only appearing after the first time acquiring the item helped cut out unnecessary screen time and sped up the game tremendously. Having fees help as optional was such a huge addition for this game. It was amazing to be able to play the game uninterrupted when I knew what my objective was. Anytime I was lost or needed a reminder for what I was looking for, she was there at my leisure. However, I did find that Fee still pops up an alarming number of times where it felt like she could have been optional. I'll get more into it later on when I'm talking about pacing, but even what bits they did make optional helped make her interactions more pleasant than in the original. Dialogue, text speed, and skippable cutscenes feel like things that should have been there from the beginning, so it's hard to really praise Nintendo on those fixes, but they are incredibly welcome. 60 frames per second. Let me say that again. 60 frames per second. Zelda in 60 frames is god tier. Okay? Like, when I first experienced it with Breath of the Wild on PC, I knew that anything less than this going forward would be a huge issue for me. I'm in love with how smooth Skyward Sword plays. The high frame rate make this game so much easier to enjoy, and it just speaks for itself. There's people out there that don't care about frame rate, and that just baffles me. There's such a noticeable difference. It's such a huge upgrade going from 30 frames to 60 frames that anything less than 60 frames, it's just painful to me. It might not be something you clearly see unless you're looking for it, but it is definitely something you can feel. That high frame rate benefits the combat and gameplay of Skyward Sword so much. While Skyward Sword HD has excelled with its new additions and fixes, its problems are deep-seated into itself, and fixing them would require an overhaul of the game that would make it something other than itself. Pacing. Skyward Sword has always and forever will be plagued with pacing issues. The game drags at times. Constant useless cutscenes and archaic gameplay elements bog this game down so much. I don't need a cutscene of the Guardians awakening when I step out into the Silent Realm. Why does Skipper's boat have a stamina gauge? It serves no purpose other than to slow your progression. Fee's optional dialogue could have been a lot more optional. She still reiterates information to a degree that is still annoying. Not nearly as much as in the original, but it felt like it could have been implemented more than it was. The limited exploration the game provides also makes the world feel small. Exploration is such a huge part of what makes Zelda, Zelda. So to have so much of the game take place retracing your steps over areas you've already explored, paired with a sky that is fairly boring and uneventful, makes this game feel shallow and too linear. The last quarter of Skyward Sword drags so much. The Song of the Hero quest takes so much time to complete after you've already completed 6 dungeons and 2 imprisoned fights, just for you to have to embark on a pointless fetch quest to get your items back, and a tedious game of tag to catch all the tad tones. Oh, and another imprisoned fight. I've long held to the belief that you fight the imprisoned way too many times. The fight isn't hard or interesting, it's just annoying and tedious. All of this bloats the game and makes it feel longer than it needed to be. I would have loved to see some alterations made to this part of the game, but sadly, it's just too fundamentally ingrained in Skyward Sword to make it work without it. As many of you are aware, I'm sure, you'll know about the controversy that surrounded this game before launch. Nintendo announced an expensive new Zelda and Loftwing amiibo that would grant the player fast travel access back to the sky from any point on the surface. People were furious that such a huge quality of life feature would be tied behind a piece of plastic that cost half the price of the game itself. I bought the amiibo myself, and in my 45 hours of playtime, I didn't use it a single time. Bird statues were plentiful enough and close enough in proximity that it never seemed worth the trouble to bother with it. I'm positive that it has great implementation, right? Like, don't get me wrong. It's helped save time, but it just wasn't something that I had to use to make the game playable. No matter how much people want to tout it as the equivalent of the Swift Sail, it simply isn't. I'm not going to argue that features like this shouldn't be in the game because they should be. This amiibo just turned out to not be a big deal for the gameplay. And you know what? I'm perfectly fine with that because it looks awesome on my amiibo shelf. When Skyward Sword first came out in 2011, it became my favorite Zelda for a short period of time. And after some time, the honeymoon phase faded away and I saw the game for what it was. But I think back to why I felt the way I did about Skyward Sword after I beat it. And it's a feeling that I have again after completing it for my third time 10 years later. Skyward Sword makes you feel so much for the world and the characters in it. Above all else, this game shines brightest with its story and characters, and that's the reason I believe so many people look to this game as their favorite Zelda. The HD version of this game solved so many of the issues I had with the original. Skyward Sword HD is the only way to play this game. It is the definitive version. This game was never an atrocity like so many people want to say it was. It was a heavily flawed Zelda game, but thanks to the revisions and fixes made here in the HD version, Skyward Sword has become one of the best entries in the series and is a must-play for any Zelda fan, new or old. There's no reason to skip on the wonderful experience that is Skyward Sword. Old fans will get the best version of the game possible, and new fans will get to experience the beginning of the Zelda timeline and a traditional style Zelda that will no longer be held with contempt but praise. It is my recommendation that you purchase Skyward Sword HD.